My name is Claire. I am 32 years old and a senior accountant. Last night, my parents slammed their heavy oak front door right in my face on Christmas Eve. Through the thick wood, I heard my mother shouting that I was banned from the holidays until I learned to apologize and respect my family. They left me standing alone in the freezing snow in my thin coat. They fully expected to return to the luxurious suburban lifestyle funded entirely by the $950,000 I had quietly provided them over the last 8 years. Before the door shut, my dad looked me dead in the eye, sneered, and told me to learn my place. I did not cry. I just smiled, got into my car, made exactly one phone call, and watched their perfect holiday collapse before the turkey was even carved. I stood there in the long paved driveway of their 5-bedroom colonial estate. The snow was falling hard and fast, catching in my hair and melting against my freezing cheeks. I could see the warm yellow light spilling from the massive bay windows of the living room. I could see the glittering silhouette of the 12-foot Christmas tree I had paid for. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of holiday music playing from the premium surround sound system I had installed for them last winter. The sheer audacity of the moment was almost beautiful to witness. They had just thrown me out into a literal blizzard, but they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a financial trapdoor and I was the one holding the lever. Just 10 minutes earlier, the house had been warm and filled with the rich scent of roasted garlic and pine. I was standing in the kitchen, basting the massive turkey, doing all the heavy lifting for the holiday meal, while my sister Jessica sat at the kitchen island drinking a glass of expensive wine. Jessica is 30 years old and has never held a job for more than 6 months. She is the golden child of the family, the one who gets whatever she wants simply by existing and smiling. Next to her sat her husband Brent. Brent is a man who calls himself an entrepreneur, but actually just burns through other people's money while wearing custom-tailored suits and acting superior. He was sipping my father's expensive scotch and aggressively scrolling through his phone. My mother Barbara breezed into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine holiday apron that she only wore for show. She looked at me and casually mentioned that Jessica had a prestigious country club gala to attend on New Year's Eve. The country club, by the way, is the exact same one that I pay the exorbitant monthly dues for, so my father can save face and play golf with his wealthy retired friends. My mother smiled a tight, demanding smile and said that Jessica needed the perfect accessory for her designer gown. She told me to go home the next morning and fetch our late grandmother's vintage diamond and sapphire necklace so Jessica could wear it to the party. I stopped basting the turkey. I set the silicone brush down on the marble counter and looked directly at my mother. That necklace was the only thing my grandmother explicitly left to me in her will. It was not a shared family asset. It was my personal property. It was the one piece of jewelry I deeply cherished because grandmother knew I was the one who always worked hard in the background, while Jessica soaked up all the praise and spotlight. I looked my mother in the eye and told her no. I said the necklace was safely locked in my apartment and it was going to stay there. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic sigh, dropping her wineglass onto the counter with a sharp clink. She whined that I was being completely unreasonable and selfish. She said she had bought the perfect dress and the vintage necklace was the only thing that would complete the look. She told me I never even went to nice events anyway, so the jewelry was just going to sit in a dark box collecting dust. She said it was incredibly unfair for me to hoard family heirlooms when she actually had a use for them. I kept my voice absolutely calm. I told her it was not a family heirloom anymore because it belonged exclusively to me. I offered to buy her a nice piece of jewelry for the gala as a late Christmas gift, but I was absolutely not lending out grandmother's necklace to be paraded around a country club. That is when Brent decided to interject. He laughed a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed loudly in the large kitchen. He looked me up and down with pure disdain and called me a selfish spinster. He said I was hoarding a piece of jewelry because I was bitter that I had no husband and no fancy parties to attend. He told me I should be grateful to lend it to my sister, who actually had a vibrant life worth dressing up for. He smirked and took another sip of the scotch I had bought. The air in the room completely vanished. I waited for my parents to say something. I waited for my father Thomas, who was sitting in the adjoining living room reading a magazine, to step in and defend his daughter. I waited for my mother to reprimand her son-in-law for speaking to me that way in their own home. Instead, my mother crossed her arms tightly across her chest and glared at me. She told me Brent was absolutely right. She said I was acting like a petulant, jealous child and ruining the entire holiday spirit for everyone. She demanded I hand over the necklace immediately or face the consequences. My father walked into the kitchen, his face flushed with sudden, unearned anger. He pointed a rigid finger at me and demanded my absolute submission. He said family shares everything, and if I was going to be stingy and disrespectful, I did not belong at their dinner table. I looked at the four of them, standing united in a semicircle against me. I realized in that crystal clear moment that they did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a resource, a human bank account that was suddenly malfunctioning because it dared to set a boundary and say no. I slowly took off the oven mitts. I placed them neatly beside the stove. I looked at my family and told them I was leaving. My mother panicked for a brief second, realizing the expensive holiday dinner was only half cooked, but her stubborn pride quickly won out over her hunger. She stormed into the hallway, grabbed my winter coat from the closet, threw it at my chest, and pushed me toward the front door. She screamed that I was banned from the house and the family until I learned to apologize and respect my superiors. My father aggressively opened the heavy front door, shoving me out onto the icy porch. He sneered at me, telling me to learn my place. Then the door slammed shut. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. Now I was standing outside in the bitter cold. I walked down the long, perfectly shoveled driveway toward my car. It is a 10-year-old Honda Civic. It is reliable, quiet, and completely out of place, parked next to Brent's leased luxury SUV and my parents' expensive European sedans. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I turned the heater up to maximum, holding my stiff, freezing hands over the vents until the painful stinging faded and feeling returned to my fingertips. I sat there in the dark driveway, watching the thick snow pile up on my windshield. A younger version of me would have cried. A younger version of me would have sat in this freezing car, sobbing uncontrollably over the rejection, wondering why she was never pretty enough, or charming enough, or good enough for her own family. A younger version of me would have driven home, grabbed the antique necklace, wrapped it in a pretty velvet box, and brought it back just to be allowed inside to eat the dinner she had cooked herself. But I am 32 years old. I am a senior accountant who manages multi-million-dollar corporate portfolios for high-net-worth clients. I am a fiercely independent woman who has secretly subsidized the very house they just threw me out of. Over the past 8 years, I had quietly funneled exactly $950,000 into their ungrateful lives. I paid the massive balloon payments on their mortgage when my father made terrible stock investments and nearly lost the estate. I covered my mother's exorbitant medical and dental insurance premiums out of my own pocket. I funded Jessica's lavish destination wedding in the Bahamas because my parents were secretly broke and too proud to admit it to her wealthy in-laws. I even poured heavy seed money into 2 of Brent's failing shell businesses just to keep the fragile peace and stop my sister from crying about their mounting debts. They thought I was just a quiet, lonely spinster with a decent job and no life. They thought the massive amounts of money I gave them was a basic obligation, a familial duty, a tax I had to pay for the sheer privilege of being allowed to exist in their presence. They thought they held all the power because they assumed they held my desperate desire for their love. But tonight, standing in that kitchen, listening to them demand my grandmother's necklace while openly mocking me, the final fragile thread of my unconditional love snapped. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale, cold blue glow in the dark cabin of my Honda. I opened my contacts and dialed the 24-hour emergency line for my private banking concierge. The phone rang twice before a polite, highly professional voice answered. "Good evening, Miss Claire," the voice said smoothly. "How can I assist you on this holiday?" "I need to make some immediate and permanent changes to my accounts," I replied. My voice was completely steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation, no grief. I want to instantly freeze all secondary credit cards linked to my primary banking account. All of them. Effective right this second. The concierge typed something rapidly on his end. "I can certainly do that for you, Miss Claire. Let me pull up the list of authorized users. I see a platinum card issued to Barbara, a gold card issued to Thomas, and a premium reserve card issued to Jessica. Shall I freeze all 3 of these accounts?" "Yes, I said, staring directly at the brightly lit living room window of my parents' house where I could see them laughing and pouring more wine. Freeze them all. Done, he said without missing a beat. Any active transactions or pre-authorizations will now decline immediately. Is there anything else you need tonight? Yes, I need you to completely cancel all recurring wire transfers and automatic bill payments scheduled from my checking account to any external accounts or vendors. Specifically, I need you to cancel the monthly mortgage payment to the estate trust, the massive monthly membership dues to the country club, and the luxury auto insurance premium for the Mercedes SUV registered to Brent. The concierge paused for a brief professional moment. Just to confirm, Miss Claire, you are canceling all scheduled financial support. This action may result in immediate late fees, service interruptions, or defaults for those specific external accounts. I am fully aware of the consequences, I said coldly. Cancel them all immediately, and I want a strict security hold placed on any future requests for funds from these individuals. If they call pretending to be me or claiming it is a medical or family emergency, you are to deny them access completely and flag the interaction. Understood, the concierge replied. All requested actions have been executed successfully. Your assets are secure, and the secondary access has been entirely revoked. Happy holidays, Miss Claire. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I shifted my car into reverse and slowly backed out of the driveway. As my headlights swept across the front of their beautiful, pristine colonial house, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of peace wash over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to buy my parents' affection was permanently gone. It had been left behind on their snowy porch, along with my patience and my fear. They had aggressively demanded that I learn my place in the family. They truly thought my place was in the background, silently funding their arrogance, while smiling and accepting their blatant abuse. They thought my place was beneath them, groveling for scraps of their attention. But they were about to discover that my actual place was at the absolute top of their financial food chain. I was the solid concrete foundation holding up their entire world. And I had just decided to step completely out of the way. I drove down the dark, snowy suburban street, leaving my toxic family and their ruined Christmas behind me, fully knowing that the real storm was just about to hit them. The heater in my 10-year-old Honda Civic blasted dry, warm air against my freezing hands as I navigated the winding, snow-covered roads of the wealthy suburb. Every massive house I passed was dripping in imported holiday lights. I drove past towering iron gates and luxury cars parked in pristine driveways. It was a completely different world from the one I actually lived in. I kept my eyes on the icy, slick road, but my mind was violently pulling me back through the last 8 years of my life. I was mentally tallying the exact cost of my toxic family. $950,000. It is a staggering amount of money. It is the kind of wealth that should buy you a lifetime of gratitude and respect. Instead, it had only bought me a front row seat to my own continuous exploitation. The financial drain started exactly 8 years ago. I was 24 years old, and I had just finalized the complex accounting logistics for a massive tech startup buyout. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks for 3 years, relentlessly managing their books through every single round of funding. When the company was finally acquired by a major global conglomerate, my equity shares vested immediately. Overnight, my bank account transformed from a modest savings into a life-changing windfall. I was young and naive, and desperate for my parents to finally be proud of me. I genuinely thought the money would be the magic key to unlocking the parental love they had always reserved entirely for my sister Jessica. I made the fatal mistake of telling my mother and father about the buyout. I took them to an expensive dinner downtown to celebrate my success. I remember the exact look that passed between them over their glasses of imported wine. It was a look of sudden, intense calculation. Less than 2 weeks after that dinner, the emotional extortion officially began. My father called me into his home office one Sunday afternoon. He looked completely defeated. He sat heavily in his expensive leather chair and buried his face in his hands. He told me a beautifully fabricated story about bad stock investments and a rapidly changing market. He manufactured tears in his eyes and choked on his words as he confessed that they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. He said the bank was preparing to foreclose on the family estate. He told me he was a total failure as a father and that he could not bear the deep shame of losing the only home my sister had ever known. Notice, he said my sister and not me. I was absolutely terrified for them. I loved them, and I finally had the resources to fix their pain. I hired a real estate attorney and silently paid off the entire ballooning mortgage balance. I wiped out nearly $400,000 of their debt completely. I spent a massive portion of my newfound wealth in a single afternoon just to secure their roof. My father hugged me that day and called me his savior. It was the first time I could ever remember him hugging me with actual warmth, but the gratitude lasted less than a month. Once the immediate threat of losing the house was gone, their entitlement expanded rapidly to fill the void. My father suddenly claimed that his reputation in the local business community was suffering. He said he desperately needed to maintain his elite country club membership to secure new clients and rebuild his wealth. The monthly dues were astronomical. I hesitated to pay them, but my mother immediately laid on the thickest guilt imaginable. She told me I was being incredibly selfish to sit on a fortune while my father lost his dignity in front of his wealthy peers. She said saving his face was my fundamental family duty. So I set up an automatic wire transfer to cover his golf club dues, his dining minimums, and their exclusive gala tickets. I became the silent, invisible sponsor of their extravagant social lives. The financial bleeding only accelerated when Jessica married Brent. Brent was a man who spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords and unearned confidence. He drove leased luxury vehicles and acted like a titan of industry, but he never actually produced anything of tangible value. When Brent proposed to my sister, my parents were secretly terrified. They had absolutely no liquid cash to throw the lavish destination wedding Jessica aggressively demanded. They were petrified that Brent's seemingly wealthy family would discover their actual financial reality. My mother cried for 3 days straight, telling me that Jessica would die of public humiliation if she could not have her dream wedding in the Bahamas. I caved to the pressure and wrote another massive check. I paid for the first-class flights, the premium resort packages, the imported exotic flowers, and the endless open bar. That was another $150,000 gone. Then came Brent's brilliant business ventures. Within 2 years of the wedding, Brent had blown through his own mysterious trust fund and desperately needed capital. He cornered me at a family Thanksgiving dinner, trapping me in the hallway with an aggressive sales pitch for a revolutionary logistics company. When I asked, as a professional accountant, to see his financial projections, he became deeply insulted. He loudly accused me of not supporting family. My father immediately stepped in and took Brent's side. He told me I was embarrassing the Dixon family by demanding standard legal paperwork from my own brother-in-law. To keep the fragile peace and stop my mother from launching into another theatrical panic attack, I agreed to provide the seed money. I poured heavy funding into his first limited liability company. It failed within 8 months due to his gross negligence. Then came the second shell company, a digital marketing agency that existed entirely on paper and fancy business cards. Brent needed more capital to keep up appearances and fund his expensive business lunches. Again, my parents relentlessly pressured me. They said Jessica was stressed about money and a good sister would step up to protect her marriage. By the time I walked out of their house tonight, the total cash injected into Brent's fraudulent empire, along with the ongoing lifestyle subsidies, pushed my total family expenditure to that nauseating $950,000 mark. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets as I merged onto the highway. The windshield wipers beat a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the angry pounding in my chest. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. For 8 years, I had rationalized every single check I wrote. I told myself that taking care of family was simply the heavy burden of the successful child. I convinced myself that my parents' demanding tone was just their awkward way of dealing with financial stress. I excused Jessica's bratty entitlement because my mother had always trained her to expect the world on a silver platter. I excused Brent's toxic arrogance because I wanted my sister to have a stable, happy marriage. I had built a towering monument of excuses for all of them. But tonight, that monument had completely crumbled into dust. They had literally locked me out in the freezing snow on a major holiday over a piece of vintage jewelry. They had demanded my absolute submission as a mandatory condition of their love. The clarity of that moment was devastating and liberating all at once. I was never a daughter to Thomas and Barbara. I was a premium subscription service. I was a very convenient automated teller machine that they could occasionally kick and insult when it did not dispense cash fast enough. I exited the highway and drove into my own quiet neighborhood. I did not live in a massive gated community with sprawling manicured lawns. I lived in a modest, unassuming apartment complex nestled safely in the city. The building was older with faded brick and a plain asphalt parking lot. I parked my reliable car in my assigned spot and turned off the engine. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but for the very first time in my adult life, it did not feel lonely. It felt incredibly safe. I pulled my coat tight against the biting wind and walked up the 3 flights of concrete stairs to my unit. The cold air burned my lungs, but my mind was completely focused and razor sharp. I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet warmth of my home. The space was small, but perfectly organized. I had furnished it with simple, comfortable pieces. There were no imported crystal chandeliers and no massive leather armchairs. It was a space funded entirely by my own hard work, and it belonged exclusively to me. I did not even bother taking off my wet boots. I walked straight to my small wooden dining table and opened my laptop. I needed absolute visual confirmation. I needed to see the severed ties with my own 2 eyes. I logged into my secure private banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying my primary asset management accounts and my standard checking ledger. I clicked on the Authorized User tab. The status next to my mother's Platinum card, my father's Gold card, and my sister's Premium Reserve card all glowed in bold red text, indicating they were permanently cancelled. I moved directly to the scheduled transfers section. The recurring monthly payments for the expensive country club dues, the luxury car insurance, and the property tax escrows were completely wiped clean. The ledger was wonderfully blank. A deep, involuntary breath escaped my lips. The tight knot of permanent anxiety that had lived at the base of my neck for 8 long years suddenly released its painful grip. I was completely free. Tomorrow morning, their entire artificial reality was going to crash down around them. The country club would decline their holiday brunch transaction. The insurance company would flag Brent's precious luxury vehicle for non-payment. The financial safety net they had violently taken for granted had been completely vaporized. I felt a sudden surge of raw, pure justice. They had told me to learn my place. I had finally learned it. My place was far away from their toxic exploitation. I reached for my mousepad, completely ready to close the browser and finally get some much-needed sleep. But before my finger could click the exit button, a bold notification popped up in the top right corner of my screen. It was an automated alert from a joint family administrative email account. I had set up this specific email address years ago to manage the digital paperwork for the estate property taxes and the various utility bills I covered for my parents. I rarely checked it anymore because the payments were all fully automated. I clicked on the notification and the inbox quickly loaded. At the very top of the list was a brand new unread message that had been sent at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, right while I was standing in their kitchen cooking their holiday meal. The sender was the commercial lending division of a major national bank. The subject line was stamped with urgent priority status. I opened the email and rapidly scanned the formal legal text. It was a final approval letter. The bank was officially congratulating the applicant on the successful authorization of a massive home equity line of credit. The loan was secured directly against the exact same suburban colonial estate that I had paid off years ago. The approved withdrawal limit was absolutely staggering, reaching deep into the 6 figures. But the sheer cold panic did not truly hit me until I scrolled down to the borrower signature section of the attached document. The primary borrower listed on this massive new debt was not my father Thomas. It was not my mother Barbara. It was not Brent or Jessica. The bold printed text at the bottom of the digital contract clearly stated the full legal name of the sole authorized borrower. It was my name. My parents and my brother-in-law had just taken out a catastrophic fraudulent loan using my entire identity. The war had not just begun. It had already turned criminal. The screen of my laptop cast a harsh pale light across my small wooden dining table. I stared at the digital inbox in absolute silence. A home equity line of credit, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The email was a formal approval notice from a major national bank. I read the terrifying word over and over again, genuinely hoping my exhausted brain was simply misinterpreting the text after a highly traumatic evening. But the black and white letters did not change. My full legal name was listed right there at the top of the document as the primary co-signer. The property listed as collateral was the exact same massive colonial estate I had quietly saved from foreclosure years ago. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. A cold, sickening sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I immediately opened a new browser tab and logged directly into my premium credit monitoring service. I frantically typed in my complex password and hit the enter key. The dashboard loaded instantly, and a massive red alert flashed aggressively across the screen. A hard inquiry had been placed on my credit profile just 3 days ago. A massive new debt obligation was suddenly attached directly to my social security number. It was entirely real. This was not a banking error. This was not a random spam email or a strange technical glitch. Someone had deliberately and methodically used my pristine identity to secure a massive loan. And based on the specific property address listed on the formal approval document, I knew exactly who the culprits were. A deep, suffocating wave of nausea washed over my entire body. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to know exactly how this catastrophic fraud had happened and exactly who was involved in the planning. My analytical mind raced through all the possible scenarios. Then I remembered the comprehensive security system. 3 years ago, my mother had called me in a frantic, tearful panic because a house in their wealthy, manicured neighborhood had been burglarized while the owners were on vacation. My mother claimed she was absolutely terrified and told me she could no longer sleep at night without constantly worrying about her safety. So, acting as the incredibly dutiful and reliable daughter I always was, I immediately hired a premium private security firm. I paid out of my own pocket for top-of-the-line, high-definition cameras to be professionally installed. They covered all the exterior doors, the long paved driveway, and the main interior living areas of the house. I set up the administrative access account myself, and I silently paid the expensive monthly cloud storage subscription without ever asking them for a single dime in return. I installed those cameras strictly to protect my aging parents from dangerous criminals. I never imagined for a single second that those exact same cameras would end up protecting me from my parents. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced speed. I navigated straight to the private security portal and entered my master administrative credentials. The sleek digital dashboard populated instantly with a grid of live camera feeds from their sprawling estate. I could see the thick winter snow still falling heavily in the driveway, coating the luxury vehicles. I could see the dark, empty kitchen where I had just spent hours cooking their extravagant holiday meal before being violently thrown out. I completely ignored the live feeds and clicked directly on the archived footage tab. I selected the discrete dome camera positioned high up in the corner of their main formal living room. I needed to know what had happened earlier today. I needed to see exactly what they were doing before the massive explosive argument over my late grandmother's necklace. I dragged the video timeline back to exactly 3:00 in the afternoon. This was roughly 2 hours before I arrived at their front door, with bags full of expensive groceries to start cooking their Christmas dinner. The archived video buffered for only a brief second, before snapping into crystal clear, high-definition playback. The formal living room was perfectly illuminated by the bright afternoon winter sun, streaming gracefully through the large custom bay windows. The giant 12-foot Christmas tree I had bought for them sparkled beautifully in the corner, casting warm, colorful reflections across the polished hardwood floor. My father Thomas was standing casually by his antique mahogany bar cart. He was pouring generous glasses of his most expensive aged bourbon. Brent, my supposedly wealthy and arrogant brother-in-law, was pacing nervously back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. He did not look like the confident, successful titan of industry he usually pretended to be during family gatherings. He looked totally frantic. He looked like a desperate man who was rapidly running out of time and options. My mother Barbara was sitting gracefully on the pristine white leather sofa. She was holding a thick stack of printed financial documents in her lap. I turned the volume up to maximum on my laptop speakers. The audio captured by the premium microphones was absolutely flawless. Brent suddenly stopped his frantic pacing and took a heavy crystal glass of bourbon directly from my father. He swallowed the dark amber liquid quickly and started speaking in a hushed, highly urgent tone. He openly told my parents that his latest venture capital investment fund had completely and totally collapsed. He admitted without any hesitation that he was severely over-leveraged and that his primary corporate creditors were threatening immediate aggressive legal action. He explicitly said that if he did not secure a massive injection of liquid cash by the absolute end of the calendar year, he was going to face total financial ruin and possible severe criminal charges for mismanaging investor funds. I sat in my quiet, modest apartment, entirely frozen in absolute shock as I watched my sister's husband confess to being a complete financial fraud. But the absolute worst part of the video was not Brent's pathetic confession. The truly devastating part was exactly how my own parents reacted to his criminal negligence. My father calmly sipped his expensive bourbon. He did not yell at Brent for endangering his daughter's financial security. He did not demand that Brent leave the house. Instead, he calmly walked over to my mother and pointed a steady finger at the thick stack of papers resting in her lap. My father confidently stated that the massive home equity line of credit was fully approved by the bank, but the lending institution required a final set of physical signatures from the primary co-signer to legally release the funds. He explained that the bank officer had already verified the initial digital application, but the final physical paperwork had to be signed, notarized, and returned by December 26th. My mother looked down at the legal documents and gently ran her manicured hand over the printed pages. She smiled a very cold, highly calculating smile. She looked right at Brent and told him not to worry about a thing. She openly bragged that she had already forged my digital signature on the initial electronic application perfectly. She boasted to the two men about how incredibly easy it was to mimic my specific handwriting because she had kept all my old birthday and holiday cards in a drawer specifically for reference. I felt the breath completely leave my lungs. My chest tightened painfully. My own mother was sitting in her beautiful living room, openly boasting about committing federal wire fraud and severe identity theft against her own daughter to save a man who constantly insulted me. But on the video, Brent still looked highly panicked. He ran his trembling hands through his expensive haircut and asked how they were possibly going to get my actual physical ink signature on the final release documents. He nervously reminded them that I was a senior professional accountant and that I would never ever sign a blank financial document without meticulously reading every single line and clause. That is the exact moment when my mother revealed the true terrifying depth of her absolute cruelty. She took a slow, elegant sip of her bourbon, adjusted her posture on the sofa, and looked at Brent with absolute predatory confidence. My mother calmly told the men that they simply needed to break my spirit. She stated that I was entirely too comfortable and far too fiercely independent for my own good. She confidently explained that the absolute only way to get me to sign the final complex loan documents without reading them was to make me profoundly desperate for their love and approval. She formulated the entire psychological abuse plan right there on the white leather sofa, while Christmas music played softly in the background. She explicitly instructed Brent to intentionally provoke me the moment I walked through the door. She told him to find something I deeply cared about and use it to start a massive emotional argument. She specifically suggested using my late grandmother's vintage diamond and sapphire necklace as the bait. She clearly stated that she knew it was the only possession in the world I truly cherished. She confidently predicted that I would absolutely refuse to hand it over to Jessica. On the video, my father slowly nodded his head in complete agreement with the malicious plan. He took another sip of his drink and said that once the argument started, he would immediately step in and heavily escalate the conflict. He said he would demand my absolute submission, and when I inevitably refused to bow down to him, he would aggressively throw me out of the house into the winter storm. He promised Brent that he would intentionally ruin my Christmas and ban me from the family entirely. Brent looked slightly unsure and asked if they were absolutely certain this incredibly harsh strategy would actually work. Brent asked what would happen if I just walked away, accepted the ban, and never came back to the house. My mother's response to that question was captured with perfect, terrifying clarity by the hidden camera. She laughed a soft, highly dismissive sound that echoed through the computer speakers. She leaned back against the plush sofa cushions, gracefully crossed her legs, and looked directly toward the hidden camera lens on the bookshelf. She spoke the exact words that severed our relationship forever. She has no one else. Give her 3 days in the cold, and she will sign whatever we put in front of her to get back in our good graces. I sat completely motionless in my small apartment, intensely staring at the frozen digital frame of my mother smiling. The silence in my room was absolute and heavy. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart was no longer racing. A profound, chilling calm settled deeply into my bones, replacing all the grief and confusion I had felt on their porch. The massive argument over the vintage necklace had been entirely fake. The arrogant insults from Brent, the dramatic, exasperated sighs from Jessica, the sudden explosive, unearned anger from my father. It was all a carefully orchestrated, theatrical performance. They had maliciously staged a fake family crisis on Christmas Eve, specifically to psychologically abuse me. They deliberately wanted to isolate me. They wanted to make me feel completely unloved and completely unwanted during the most vulnerable emotional time of the entire year. They purposefully weaponized my deep lingering desire for a loving family and used it as a blunt tool to manipulate me into signing a fraudulent loan that would have ruined my professional reputation and my financial future forever. I closed the laptop screen. I did not shed a single tear. They wanted me to be desperate, but instead, they had just made me dangerous. I woke up on Christmas morning to a profound and absolute silence. For the first time in 32 years, I was not standing in my mother's sprawling kitchen at the crack of dawn. I was not rushing to prepare a lavish holiday breakfast for 20 demanding guests. I was not polishing the good silver or ironing the heavy linen napkins. I was simply lying in my own comfortable bed in my quiet apartment, watching the bright winter sunlight stream through the frost-covered windows. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for my entire adult life was completely gone. I felt lighter than air. I stretched my legs under the warm blankets and allowed myself to deeply enjoy the peace. But I knew the peace would not last. I knew exactly what was happening across town in that massive colonial estate. My phone was sitting face down on the wooden nightstand. I reached over and flipped it face up. The screen immediately lit up with an absolute avalanche of notifications. The digital display showed 47 missed calls. There were 62 unread text messages and 8 urgent voicemails. The barrage had started at exactly 8 in the morning and had escalated into a frantic, desperate frenzy by 9:30. I did not feel a single ounce of panic as I scrolled through the endless wall of text messages. I felt like a forensic accountant reviewing a completely predictable audit. The first few messages from my mother Barbara were laced with extreme annoyance. She thought there was a simple banking error. She texted me to say the catering company was trying to run the final payment for the holiday brunch and my platinum card was declining. She demanded that I call my private bank immediately and authorize the $4,000 charge. She reminded me that Brent's wealthy parents had just arrived and she needed everything to be absolutely perfect. The messages quickly shifted from mild annoyance to outright panic. 30 minutes later, she texted again in all capital letters. She wrote that the professional waitstaff were standing in her kitchen holding their portable credit card machine and refusing to serve the imported smoked salmon and the vintage champagne until the invoice was settled. She said she was deeply humiliated. She said Brent's mother was watching her from the formal dining room. She demanded to know why I was ignoring her messages. By 10 in the morning, the messages turned vicious. My father Thomas had taken over. His texts were aggressive and threatening. He commanded me to answer the phone immediately. He said my petty temper tantrum was destroying their Christmas. He told me that if I did not fix the credit card issue right that second, I would be permanently disowned. I read his empty threats and I actually smiled. He could not disown me. I was the one who owned the financial foundation of his entire artificial life. He was a tenant in a house I had saved, living a luxury lifestyle I had exclusively funded. I slowly got out of bed and walked to my small kitchen. I brewed a simple pot of coffee, taking my time to enjoy the rich, bitter aroma. I poured myself a hot cup and walked over to the living room window. I looked out at the snow-covered city streets. I pictured my mother standing in her expensive holiday dress, gripping a useless piece of plastic, while a catering manager patiently explained that her account was permanently closed. I pictured my arrogant brother-in-law Brent, sweating in his custom-tailored suit, completely unable to step in and pay the $4,000 bill because he was secretly drowning in massive fraudulent debt. They had thrown me out into a freezing blizzard just 14 hours ago to break my spirit. Now they were trapped in a beautiful house filled with expensive food they could not afford to eat. My phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. The caller identification flashed with my father's name. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. I let it ring 3 times before I finally pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. "Turn the cards back on right now," my father roared. His voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth or basic human decency. It was the harsh, desperate bark of a man who was rapidly losing his grip on a fabricated reality. "You are humiliating us in front of Brent's family." I stood perfectly still, letting his unwarranted anger wash over me. The emotional manipulation that would have instantly reduced me to tears just 24 hours ago now felt incredibly hollow. I did not hear a powerful patriarch demanding respect. I heard a terrified dependent realizing his free ride was permanently over. "The bank is closed for the holiday, Thomas," I said. My voice was eerily calm and entirely flat. I decided right then to stop calling him Dad. He had forfeited that title when he slammed the door in my face. And even if the bank were open, it would not matter. The secondary cards are completely cancelled. The accounts are permanently closed. You will have to find another way to pay for your luxury brunch. There was a sudden, shocked silence on the line. My father was entirely unaccustomed to me speaking to him with such cold authority. He sputtered, trying to find the right words to regain his dominance. "You ungrateful, vicious little girl," he finally snarled. "You do not get to dictate terms to this family. You will call your private concierge right this second, and you will authorize the transfer. Brent's parents are sitting in my living room expecting a catered meal. We do not have $4,000 in liquid cash to pay these caterers." "That sounds like a personal financial crisis," I replied smoothly, taking another sip of my coffee. "Perhaps you should ask Brent to cover the invoice. He's a highly successful entrepreneur, is he not? He should have no problem paying a simple catering bill to save his mother-in-law from public embarrassment." I knew exactly what I was doing. I was pressing my finger directly into the deepest, rawest nerve of their entire fraudulent existence. I had watched the hidden security camera footage. I knew Brent was completely broke. I knew he was facing severe legal trouble from his investors. I knew my parents were fully aware of his impending ruin and had desperately tried to forge a massive home equity loan in my name to bail him out. Mentioning Brent's supposed wealth was a direct targeted strike, and it hit the mark perfectly. I heard a sudden violent scuffle on the other end of the phone. I heard my father protesting, and then a new voice came through the speaker. It was Brent. He had snatched the phone right out of my father's hand. He was breathing heavily, and I could practically visualize the ugly, arrogant sneer on his face. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire." Brent spat into the receiver. He lowered his voice, trying to sound incredibly dangerous and deeply authoritative. "You are playing a very stupid game right now, and you are going to lose. You cannot just abruptly cut off the established financial flow to this estate. You have set a distinct legal precedent of support, and you are currently in severe breach of family financial commitments." I actually let out a genuine laugh. The sound echoed brightly in my quiet apartment. Breach of family financial commitments. It was a completely fabricated legal concept. Brent was tossing around impressive-sounding corporate buzzwords, hoping to intimidate a woman he believed was just a weak, lonely spinster. He clearly forgot that I was a licensed senior accountant who managed complex multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living. I dealt with ruthless corporate sharks every single day. Brent was nothing but a desperate minnow trying to sound like a great white. "Are you actively threatening me with imaginary legal concepts, Brent?" I asked. My tone was laced with pure professional amusement. "Because if you want to discuss actual legal precedents, we should probably start by discussing federal wire fraud. We should probably discuss the severe criminal penalties for forging a signature on a commercial banking application for a massive home equity line of credit." The absolute dead silence that followed my words was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. All the blustering arrogance, all the fake corporate authority immediately vanished from Brent's end of the line. He stopped breathing. I could vividly picture the exact moment the blood completely drained from his perfectly tanned face. He knew that I knew. He realized in a fraction of a second that their brilliant master plan to forge my signature and steal hundreds of thousands of dollars was completely exposed. I did not give him a chance to recover or formulate a new lie. I kept my voice perfectly measured, delivering every word with surgical precision. You and my parents made a catastrophic miscalculation yesterday, I continued. You assumed I was stupid enough to blindly fund this family without implementing comprehensive security measures. You assumed I would never find out about the loan application. You threw me out into the snow to break my spirit, hoping I would come crawling back completely desperate to sign whatever documents you placed in front of me. But you failed. You all failed miserably. Claire, please, Brent stammered. His voice had suddenly lost all of its fake corporate power. It was high-pitched and trembling with raw, genuine panic. You're completely misunderstanding the situation. We can explain everything if you just come back to the house. We can sit down like adults and work this out. There is absolutely nothing left to work out, Brent, I stated firmly. The financial support is permanently terminated. You will not get a single dime from me to cover your failed venture capital investments. You will not get a single dime to cover your secret gambling debts. And you will certainly not get my signature on that fraudulent loan. You and my parents are going to have to face your financial ruin completely on your own. You cannot do this to us, Brent yelled, his voice cracking with pure desperation. We will lose everything. My investors are threatening to go to the authorities. Thomas and Barbara will lose the country club. Jessica will leave me. You are destroying our entire lives over a petty grudge. I will have my corporate lawyers sue you for everything you are worth. I smiled, looking out the window at the peaceful, snowy street. Bring your imaginary corporate lawyers, Brent. I challenged him softly. Bring them directly to me. I would absolutely love to show them the crystal clear high-definition security footage of you and my mother actively conspiring to commit severe identity theft. I am sure your investors and the federal authorities would be highly interested in watching that specific video. Brent let out a strange, panicked sound that was half gasp and half sob. I could hear my mother screaming hysterically in the background, demanding to know what I was saying to him. I could hear the catering manager raising his voice, demanding immediate payment or threatening to pack up the food and leave. The entire grand illusion of the wealthy, flawless Dixon family was burning to the ground right there in their pristine colonial kitchen. Good luck with the caterers, Brent, I said casually. I hope your parents enjoy the show. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I did not block their numbers yet. I wanted them to waste their energy leaving panicked voicemails and sending desperate, frantic texts that I would never answer. I wanted them to slowly realize the absolute terrifying permanence of their situation. I walked back to my kitchen counter and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The adrenaline that had been surging through my veins slowly began to settle, leaving behind a profound, crystal-clear sense of purpose. The weak, desperate girl who just wanted her parents to love her was completely dead and gone. She had died on that freezing porch last night. The woman standing in the apartment was a highly skilled financial professional who had just uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy directed squarely at her own identity. I took my coffee and sat down at my dining table. I opened my laptop and created a brand new encrypted folder on my hard drive. I systematically downloaded every single piece of evidence. I saved the security camera video files, securing the crystal clear audio of my mother confessing to the forgery. I downloaded the digital logs of the fraudulent loan application, including the exact timestamps and the specific internet protocol addresses that traced directly back to my parents' suburban house. I pulled years of comprehensive banking records, meticulously highlighting every single dollar I had ever transferred to them, validating my absolute financial dominance over their entire estate. I was no longer reacting with pure emotion. The deep, lingering sadness of being the unloved spare child was entirely gone. It had been cleanly replaced by a cold, calculated, and highly methodical resolve. My parents and Brent had crossed a massive, unforgivable line. They had transitioned from ungrateful emotional abusers into actual desperate criminals attempting to ruin my entire financial future for their own selfish gain. They had openly declared war on me on Christmas Eve, expecting a swift and total surrender. They severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I had spent 8 long years building their perfect, comfortable world, and I knew exactly which load-bearing pillars to completely destroy, to bring the entire structure crashing down around them. The emotional war of my childhood was officially over. The brutal, relentless legal war had just begun. The morning of December 26th was bitterly cold. The sky over the city was a flat, bruised grey, but the streets were entirely clear of snow. I drove downtown in my Honda Civic, merging into the light holiday traffic with a sense of absolute clarity. The emotional devastation that had crushed my chest just 2 days ago was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, cold focus. I parked in the underground garage of a towering glass and steel high-rise in the financial district. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor. The polished brass doors slid open to reveal the reception area of Hayes & Associates. Evelyn Hayes was a formidable financial and real estate attorney. She was in her late 50s with sharp silver hair, cropped short and piercing dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I had worked with her firm on several complex corporate acquisitions over the years, and I knew her reputation perfectly. Evelyn was ruthless, meticulous, and fiercely protective of her clients. She did not tolerate fools, and she certainly did not lose cases. When I called her personal cell phone late on Christmas Day, she had immediately agreed to meet me first thing the following morning. I walked into her spacious corner office. The walls were lined with thick legal volumes, and the massive windows overlooked the sprawling city skyline. Evelyn was already sitting behind her heavy mahogany desk, wearing a pristine tailored suit. She did not offer me platitudes or false sympathy. She knew I was a professional, and she treated me exactly like one. She simply gestured to the leather chair opposite her and asked me to lay out the situation. I unzipped my briefcase and pulled out the thick folder I had assembled over the holiday. I handed her the printed approval notice for the massive home equity line of credit. I watched her eyes scan the document tracking the 6-figure amount, the listed collateral, and my forged signature at the bottom of the page. Then I handed her the secure flash drive containing the high-definition security footage and the pristine audio recordings from my parents' living room. I sat perfectly still as Evelyn plugged the drive into her computer. I listened to the crystal-clear audio of my mother boasting about forging my signature. I listened to my father agreeing to aggressively throw me out into the blizzard to break my spirit. I listened to Brent plotting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his criminal gambling debts. Evelyn watched the entire video without making a single sound. Her expression remained completely unreadable until the footage ended. She slowly closed her laptop and folded her hands on her desk. She looked at me dead in the eye, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "They did not just take advantage of you, Claire," she said, her voice deadly serious. "This is federal wire fraud and forgery. This is a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit severe identity theft." Hearing a respected legal professional validate the absolute insanity of my situation felt like a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. I was not being dramatic. I was not overreacting. My family had crossed a line that put them squarely in the crosshairs of the federal justice system. Evelyn explained that by using digital banking networks to transmit fraudulent loan applications across state lines, my mother and Brent had triggered federal wire fraud statutes. The penalties for these crimes were not just fines or slaps on the wrist. They carried mandatory prison sentences. I asked her what our first move should be. I expected her to say we needed to call the police or alert the bank immediately. But Evelyn Hayes was a master tactician. She leaned back in her chair and told me that while the criminal charges were a devastating weapon, we needed to secure my financial assets and establish absolute dominance over the battlefield before we dropped the bomb. She asked me to detail the exact history of the property listed as collateral on the fraudulent loan. She needed to know everything about the estate my parents lived in. I took a deep breath and explained the financial history I had constructed 8 years ago. I told her about the day my father broke down in tears, claiming the bank was foreclosing on the family home. I explained how I had used the massive windfall from my startup buyout to pay off the nearly $400,000 mortgage balance in a single afternoon. I had done it quickly and quietly to save my father's pride. I had never asked for a thank you, and they had certainly never offered one. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. She picked up a legal pad and a silver pen. She asked me exactly how the transaction was structured. She asked if I simply wired the funds to my father's bank account or if I wrote him a personal check. I shook my head. I told her I was a senior accountant, even back then. I never handed over raw cash to anyone without a proper paper trail. I had hired an independent real estate lawyer to handle the transaction directly with the lending institution. I purchased the defaulted debt from the bank entirely. A slow, calculating smile spread across Evelyn's face. She turned to her computer and rapidly typed into the county property records database. The office was silent, except for the sharp clicking of her keyboard. After a few tense minutes, she stopped typing and turned the monitor around so I could see the screen. The official county deed was displayed in bright digital text. I stared at the name listed under the primary property ownership. It was my name, Claire. Evelyn leaned forward and tapped the screen. She explained the brilliant reality of what I had done 8 years ago. By purchasing the defaulted debt directly from the bank and satisfying the lien under my own name, the property title had legally transferred to me. My parents had lived in that sprawling, luxurious suburban estate for 8 years, completely oblivious to the fact that they did not own a single brick of it. They had blindly assumed the house was completely theirs, free and clear, simply because the bank stopped sending foreclosure notices. They were so utterly consumed by their own arrogance and entitlement that they never even bothered to check the official county records. The sheer irony of the situation hit me like a physical blow. My mother had thrown me out of my own house. My father had stood in my foyer and told me to learn my place. They had locked me out in a freezing blizzard to assert their dominance over a property I fully owned. And now they were actively attempting to take out a massive fraudulent loan against a house that belonged exclusively to me. Evelyn set her pen down and looked at me with deep professional respect. "Your parents are not homeowners," she said smoothly. "They have zero equity in that estate. Legally speaking, Thomas and Barbara are nothing more than month-to-month tenants living in your property. And considering there is absolutely no formal lease agreement in place, you have the absolute legal right to terminate their residency." We sat in her office and meticulously drafted the ultimate legal strike. We were not just going to cut off the country club dues and the luxury car insurance. We were going to completely dismantle their entire false reality. Evelyn outlined the master plan step by step. First, we would contact the National Bank immediately. We would provide the definitive proof of ownership and the security camera footage to instantly kill the fraudulent loan application before a single dollar could be disbursed. Second, we would prepare a comprehensive forensic dossier of Brent's financial crimes and my mother's forgery. We would hold this dossier as the ultimate leverage. If they tried to fight me or drag my name through the mud, I would hand the entire file directly to the district attorney. But the final step was the most devastating. Evelyn drafted a formal legal notice of eviction. It was a perfectly standard 30-day notice to vacate the premises. It coldly and professionally informed Thomas and Barbara that their month-to-month tenancy was being permanently terminated by the legal owner of the property. It demanded that they remove all personal belongings and surrender the keys or face immediate removal by local law enforcement. I read over the drafted eviction notice. The legal language was stark and completely unforgiving. There was no emotion in the text, just absolute definitive power. For 32 years, my parents had dictated every aspect of my life. They had drained my bank accounts, insulted my character, and treated me like disposable stuff. They truly believed I was a weak, dependent child who would always come running back for their scraps of affection. They were about to learn that the quiet, reliable daughter they had abused for decades was holding all the cards. Evelyn printed the final documents on thick, heavy bonded paper. She placed them neatly into a crisp leather folder. She told me that her firm would handle the formal delivery. A licensed courier would hand the eviction notice directly to my father. There would be no frantic phone calls, no emotional screaming matches, and no opportunity for my mother to manipulate the narrative. The next time they heard from me, it would be through the undeniable force of the law. We spent the next 2 hours securing the perimeter of my new legal fortress. Evelyn contacted the fraud department of the bank that had issued the home equity line of credit approval. The conversation was incredibly brief and highly effective. Once Evelyn provided her credentials and transmitted the county deed, proving I was the sole owner of the collateral property, the bank executive on the other end of the line sounded physically ill. When she added that we possessed video evidence of the applicants forging my signature, the executive immediately flagged the account for internal investigation. The loan was dead. The money Brent desperately needed to save himself from ruin was permanently blocked. I sat in the leather chair watching Evelyn work and felt a profound sense of awe. This is what it looked like to have someone truly fight for you. I had spent my entire life fighting for my family, protecting them from their own terrible decisions, buffering them from the harsh realities of the world. I had acted as their shield, their bank, their uncomplaining servant. Now I was finally fighting for myself, and I had a relentless professional in my corner to make sure I won. Evelyn hung up the phone and looked across the desk at me. The bank has locked the application, she confirmed. They are freezing your parents' accounts pending a fraud review. Your brother-in-law is not getting a single cent. I nodded slowly, absorbing the massive shift in reality. What happens when the courier delivers the eviction notice, I asked. Evelyn smiled a very cold, very practiced smile. They will panic, she said. They will likely try to contact you to scream or manipulate or threaten. You will not answer. You will direct all communication to my office. We are building a very specific trap, Claire. We want them to feel the full weight of their actions closing in on them. When people who are used to absolute control suddenly realize they have none, they make mistakes. We want them to make mistakes. I thanked Evelyn and walked out of her office into the bright, cold afternoon. The grey clouds had finally broken and pale winter sunlight was streaming through the city streets. I held the leather folder tightly against my chest. The emotional war of my childhood was officially over. The trap was perfectly set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. I returned to my quiet apartment and locked the door behind me. The winter air outside was bitter and biting, but inside my home, I felt a profound radiating warmth. I placed the heavy leather folder from Evelyn on my dining table and opened my laptop. My hands were completely steady. I was a senior accountant, and my entire professional life was built on meticulous organization and ruthless precision. I spent my days tracking complex assets, managing massive liabilities, and balancing corporate ledgers. For 8 long years, my family had been my single greatest liability. They were a massive draining expense that yielded absolutely zero emotional return. Today, I was officially closing their accounts. I sat down in my comfortable chair and pulled up my master financial spreadsheet. I had categorized every single dollar I ever spent on my parents and my sister. Looking at the staggering numbers, now I did not feel foolish. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I was about to execute a series of targeted financial strikes that would systematically dismantle their entire luxurious facade. I was going to strip away the unearned privilege they wore like a heavy suit of armor. I decided to start with my sister, Jessica. 2 years ago, Jessica had decided she absolutely needed a brand new pristine white Mercedes sport utility vehicle. She had just given birth to her second child, and she loudly claimed that her previous car was no longer safe or prestigious enough for a mother in her wealthy social circle. Brent had enthusiastically encouraged this extravagant lease, even though his shell companies were secretly bleeding cash. The day they went to the luxury dealership, they suddenly realized they lacked the liquid funds to cover the massive comprehensive insurance policy required to drive the car off the lot. My mother had called me in tears. She begged me to help, saying my sister could not possibly transport my niece and nephew in an unsafe vehicle. I had relented. I paid the exorbitant premium in full, and I had continued to pay it every single month since that day. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the auto insurance portal. I entered my secure credentials and accessed the primary dashboard. The screen displayed the active policy for the white Mercedes. I stared at the digital button that read, Terminate coverage. I thought about Jessica sitting at my mother's kitchen island, sipping expensive wine and calling me a selfish spinster. I thought about how she felt entirely entitled to demand my late grandmother's necklace while I quietly paid to keep her luxury car on the road. I moved my cursor over the red button and clicked it. A secondary warning prompt appeared on the screen. The text clearly stated that terminating the policy would immediately trigger an automated notification to the primary lien holder and the leasing company. In the world of high-end auto leases, maintaining comprehensive insurance is a strict non-negotiable requirement. A leased luxury vehicle without active coverage is considered an immediate unprotected liability. The moment the leasing company receives the termination notice, they issue an automatic repossession order. I confirmed the cancellation without a single second of hesitation. The policy status instantly changed from active to terminated. I leaned back and vividly pictured the inevitable moment when a loud, heavy tow truck would pull into my parents' pristine, snowy driveway to physically drag away Jessica's ultimate status symbol. With the first domino officially knocked over, I moved to the second target. This strike was aimed directly at the foundation of my parents' entire social identity, the exclusive elite country club. My father, Thomas, treated that club like his own personal royal kingdom. He spent his afternoons playing 18 holes of golf and drinking imported scotch with retired corporate executives. My mother, Barbara, hosted her extravagant charity luncheons in the main dining room, parading around in expensive designer clothes. They used that membership to project a flawless image of immense generational wealth and sophisticated grace. They soaked up the respect and admiration of their peers, but they never once mentioned to any of their wealthy friends that their quiet single daughter was the one paying the astronomical monthly membership dues. They never told anyone that I was covering the thousands of dollars in mandatory dining minimums and the expensive gala tickets. I was the invisible sponsor of their grand social illusion. I opened the dedicated administrative email account I used to correspond with the country club management. I opened a new blank message and addressed it directly to the senior director of membership. I did not use any emotional language. I drafted a cold, formal, and highly professional directive. I stated clearly and unequivocally that I was withdrawing my financial sponsorship for Thomas and Barbara, effective immediately. I instructed the director to completely sever my banking details and credit cards from their member profiles. I explicitly noted that any future charges incurred by them would be their sole personal responsibility and that my accounts were permanently locked to any club transactions. I read over the brief email to ensure the tone was absolutely unyielding. Then I hit send. The country club operates on a remarkably strict zero-tolerance policy for unpaid accounts and invalid payment methods. I knew exactly how their system worked. By tomorrow morning, their membership cards would be completely deactivated in the central database. When my father tried to drive his golf cart onto the pristine green, the attendants would gently but firmly ask him to leave. When my mother tried to order her usual expensive lunch, the waiter would politely inform her that her account was suspended. They would be turned away at the velvet roped entrance of the upcoming New Year's Eve gala. The social humiliation would be absolute public and completely inescapable. They would have to face the judging eyes of the exact same people they had spent years trying to impress. The final action required a much heavier and more devastating strike. I opened a deeply buried folder on my encrypted hard drive. It contained the original legal documents for the $150,000 seed money I had provided to Brent's failing logistics company years ago. I remembered the exact day I gave him that money. My parents had aggressively cornered me in their hallway, accusing me of being terribly unsupportive because I dared to ask for a formal contract. They told me that family relies on trust and that asking for legal paperwork was an insult to Brent's honor. But my sharp professional instincts had forced me to draft a strict commercial promissory note anyway. I refused to hand over that much cash without protecting myself. Buried deep in the dense legal clauses of that promissory note was a specific provision known in the financial industry as a call-in clause. This powerful legal mechanism gave me the absolute right to demand immediate repayment of the entire principal balance in the event of a material breach of trust or undeniable financial instability. Brent's recorded confession on the hidden security camera was the ultimate irrefutable proof of severe financial instability. He had openly admitted to being over-leveraged broke and facing criminal charges from angry investors. The condition for the call-in clause was perfectly met. I pulled up the aggressive legal template that Evelyn had provided me earlier that morning. I meticulously filled in the exact dates, the total principal amount owed, and the formal demand for immediate repayment. I stated in clear, uncompromising terms that he had exactly 30 days to produce $150,000 in cleared funds. I wrote that if he failed to meet this strict deadline, I would initiate immediate aggressive litigation to seize all his remaining business assets and garnish whatever personal accounts he had left. I attached a certified digital signature to the bottom of the demand letter. I wanted to ensure he could not hide this catastrophic development from anyone. I routed the formal notice directly to Brent's primary business email address. Then I deliberately copied his remaining corporate investors and his silent partners on the email chain. I knew sending it to them would completely destroy any remaining shreds of his fake entrepreneurial reputation. It would expose him as a desperate fraud who was heavily indebted to his own sister-in-law. I moved my finger to the mousepad and clicked send. The heavy digital file vanished into the ether, rocketing through the internet directly toward his inbox. I sat back in my wooden dining chair and let out a long, slow breath. The quiet hum of my refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. I had just systematically dismantled their entire luxurious lifestyle in less than 45 minutes. Every single action felt like a massive heavy stone being permanently lifted from my chest. I watched the snow falling steadily outside my window, and I visualized the beautiful, devastating domino effect I had just unleashed upon them. The cancelled auto insurance would instantly trigger the mandatory car repossession, leaving Jessica completely stranded and publicly humiliated in her wealthy neighborhood. The revoked country club membership would shatter my parents' carefully constructed social standing, leaving them isolated from their elite friends. The aggressively demanded loan repayment would force Brent into a terrifying legal corner he could not manipulate or charm his way out of. For 8 long years, they had worn my hard-earned money like an impenetrable suit of armor. They truly believed their wealth made them untouchable and superior to me. They thought their arrogance was a permanent condition. They had completely forgotten that I was the unseen architect who built their beautiful fortress, and I was the only one who held the power to strip it all away. I sat in the gathering dusk of my apartment and felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering sadness and no remorse for the pain they were about to experience. I only felt a cold, stunning clarity. I had finally stopped trying to buy the basic love and respect of people who only loved my bank account. The unearned privilege they wore, like armor, was gone, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh reality they had created for themselves. I arrived at my corporate office 2 days before New Year's Eve, feeling a sense of absolute tranquility. The financial district of Seattle was bustling with holiday energy, but my mind was completely still. I sat at my large glass desk and looked out over the gray waters of the Puget Sound. For the first time in my professional career, I was not frantically checking my personal bank accounts to see if my family had overdrafted my funds. I was not anxiously waiting for my mother, Barbara, to send me an urgent text message demanding money for some fabricated emergency. I had successfully severed every single financial cord that tied me to their toxic world. Evelyn Hayes, my brilliant attorney, had promised me that the consequences of my actions would hit them like a freight train. She was absolutely right. The heavy silence of the past few days was merely the receding water before a massive tidal wave. They had spent the days immediately following Christmas, assuming I was simply throwing a petty tantrum. They truly believed I was sitting alone in my apartment, crying over my punishment and begging for their forgiveness. They thought the cancelled credit cards were just a temporary glitch or a brief manifestation of my anger. They had absolutely no idea that I had completely dismantled their entire financial ecosystem. The blissful ignorance of their suburban bubble was about to be violently shattered. The first massive shockwave hit at exactly noon. My office phone remained silent, but my personal cell phone suddenly began to vibrate wildly across my desk. The caller identification flashed with my sister Jessica's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. It immediately rang again and again in a frantic, endless loop. I finally picked up the device and pressed the green button to answer. I did not even get the chance to say hello before a piercing, hysterical scream erupted from the speaker. Jessica was sobbing so violently that I could barely understand her words. She was completely, utterly unhinged. She shrieked that she was standing in the grand circular driveway of the elite country club. She had driven there to meet her wealthy friends for an expensive holiday luncheon to show off her perfect life. But when she handed her keys to the valet, a heavy commercial tow truck had suddenly aggressively pulled into the pristine driveway. The tow truck driver did not care about her designer dress or her country club status. He simply hooked up her pristine white luxury Mercedes Sport utility vehicle and hoisted it into the air in front of dozens of wealthy onlookers. Jessica screamed into the phone, demanding to know what I had done. She cried that her wealthy friends were standing on the steps of the clubhouse, openly staring and whispering about her. She said she was profoundly humiliated and that her social life was completely ruined forever. She commanded me to call the leasing company and the insurance provider right that very second to fix my terrible mistake. She actually ordered me to pay whatever penalties were required and have the car returned to her immediately. I sat at my desk and listened to her frantic, desperate demands. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I remembered how she had sat in my mother's kitchen sipping expensive wine and calling me a selfish spinster. I remembered how she felt completely entitled to take my late grandmother's necklace while contributing absolutely nothing to the family. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly flat. I told Jessica that I was no longer her personal financial assistant. I calmly explained that since she was a 30-year-old married woman with a highly successful entrepreneur husband, she could simply ask Brent to buy her a new car. I told her to enjoy her walk home in the freezing weather, and I ended the call. The sheer power of simply hanging up the phone was incredibly intoxicating. The second shockwave detonated less than an hour later. This one was far more destructive because it involved my arrogant brother-in-law Brent. Brent had spent years cultivating a flawless image as a wealthy, brilliant businessman. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove luxury cars, but his entire empire was built on a crumbling foundation of lies and my stolen money. When Evelyn Hayes contacted the National Bank to flag the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the bank did not just cancel the application. They triggered a massive internal fraud investigation. That investigation immediately froze all pending financial transactions associated with Brent's failing shell companies. The aggressive calling clause Y had activated on his original seed money had also reached his primary investors. The financial dominoes fell with brutal, terrifying speed. I received an automated email notification from my legal monitoring service indicating that Brent's primary business accounts had been completely locked by his creditors. He was officially entirely out of liquid cash. Without the massive injection of stolen funds from the fraudulent home equity loan, Brent could not cover his secret gambling debts or pay back his furious investors. His silent partners had received my formal legal demand letter, and they were completely panicking. They realized Brent was a total fraud who was desperately trying to steal from his own sister-in-law just to stay afloat. My mother, Barbara, attempted to call me 12 times in a span of 30 minutes. I knew exactly why she was calling. Brent must have returned to their suburban estate in a state of absolute terror. The reality of his impending criminal charges and total financial ruin was finally crashing down on him. My mother was likely calling to scream at me, to beg me to manipulate me into dropping the call-in clause and releasing the funds. She probably wanted to tell me that family protects family and that I was destroying her precious daughter's marriage. I completely ignored every single call. I simply placed my phone in a desk drawer and returned to my professional work. I was managing complex corporate accounts for decent, honest people. I had no time to manage the self-inflicted crisis of a man who had openly mocked me and a mother who had gleefully forged my signature. They were finally experiencing the real-world consequences of their own malicious actions. The third shockwave was the most physical and desperate of them all. At exactly 3 p.m, my office desk phone buzzed. It was the head of corporate security down in the main lobby of my building. The security director spoke in a very cautious professional tone. He informed me that an older gentleman claiming to be my father was currently causing a massive scene at the front reception desk. Thomas had bypassed the security protocols and was aggressively demanding to be allowed up to the 40th floor. The director said the man was highly agitated, red in the face, and shouting completely irrational threats about family respect and financial obligations. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I could not see the lobby from my height, but I could vividly picture my father standing there. Thomas was a man who relied entirely on his commanding presence and his false wealthy persona to intimidate people. He expected the world to simply bow down to his authority, but he was not standing in his expensive suburban country club. He was standing in a highly secure corporate high-rise where his fake prestige meant absolutely nothing. I spoke clearly into the phone. I told the security director that the man was indeed my biological father, but he had absolutely no authorization to be on the premises. I explicitly stated that he was a hostile individual, and I requested that he be removed from the building immediately. The security director confirmed my instructions without any hesitation. Less than 5 minutes later, I stood at the glass, looking down at the rainy city street far below. I watched as the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. 2 large, uniformed security guards firmly escorted my father out onto the wet concrete sidewalk. Thomas was physically resisting, gesturing wildly with his arms and pointing up at the towering glass building. He looked incredibly small and utterly pathetic, standing in the cold Seattle rain. He was no longer the powerful patriarch who could violently throw his daughter out into a blizzard with a single cruel command. He was just an angry, helpless old man who had completely lost control of his primary source of income. I watched him pull out his cell phone, presumably to call me again. I watched him yell into the device when it went straight to voicemail. Then I watched him slowly walk away, defeated and broken, disappearing into the busy city crowd. I did not feel a single drop of remorse. The final devastating blow arrived just as the winter sun began to set over the mountains. Evelyn Hayes had promised me a flawless execution of our legal strategy, and she delivered perfectly. I received a brief encrypted text message from her private number confirming that the licensed courier had successfully arrived at the massive suburban colonial estate. I closed my eyes and let my mind visualize the exact scene unfolding at my childhood home. I pictured my mother Barbara exhausted from dealing with crying Jessica and frantic Brent opening the heavy oak front door. She probably expected another angry creditor or a confused neighbor. Instead, she found a serious professional courier holding a thick, crisp legal folder bearing the intimidating seal of Hayes & Associates. The courier would not answer her frantic questions or listen to her dramatic, emotional pleas. He would simply hand her the documents, demand a signature of receipt, and walk away into the cold evening. Inside that heavy leather folder was the absolute destruction of their entire fabricated reality. The documents clearly and undeniably proved that I was the sole legal owner of the sprawling estate they falsely claimed as their own. The papers exposed the undeniable truth that they had been living rent-free on my silent generosity for 8 long years. And resting right on top of those property deeds was the formal aggressive 30-day notice to vacate the premises. It was a stark, unforgiving legal mandate, ordering Thomas and Barbara to pack up their expensive imported furniture, their designer clothes, and their fragile, arrogant egos. It commanded them to permanently leave the home they thought they controlled or face immediate physical removal by local law enforcement. There was no room for negotiation. There was no room for maternal guilt trips or patriarchal demands. It was the cold, hard, unavoidable law. For my entire life, my parents had used that house as a weapon against me. They had used it to establish their superiority, to demand my obedience, and to violently punish me when I dared to assert my own boundaries. They had thrown me out into the snow to teach me a lesson about my place in their world. But the ultimate lesson was entirely mine to teach. I sat at my glass desk in the quiet peace of my secure office, looking out at the darkening city skyline. I had completely pulled the plug on their $950,000 illusion. The first series of shockwaves had successfully hit their targets with absolute devastating precision. My toxic family was finally learning exactly what happens when you try to destroy the only person holding up your entire world. The heavy, violent pounding on my apartment door started just after 7 in the evening. I was sitting in my quiet living room sorting through some final corporate tax files for my accounting clients when the sudden noise echoed through the small space. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, relentless hammering of someone who felt entirely entitled to break down any barrier that stood in their way. I calmly closed my laptop and walked over to the entryway. I looked through the small glass peephole and felt a cold wave of absolute satisfaction wash over me. Standing in my brightly lit hallway were my sister Jessica and her husband Brent. They did not look like the flawless, wealthy suburban couple they usually pretended to be. The polished, arrogant facade they had worn so proudly at my parents' house on Christmas Eve was completely gone. Jessica looked entirely unhinged. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled, and her face was heavily streaked with smeared makeup. She was wearing a high-end designer winter coat, but beneath it I could clearly see a pair of wrinkled grey sweatpants. Beside her stood Brent. He looked like a cornered animal. His custom-tailored charcoal suit was severely wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose around his neck, and his face was flushed, bright red with a mixture of raw panic and barely contained rage. I slowly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. I kept my hand firmly on the brass handle, blocking their path. Before I could even say a single word, Brent aggressively pushed his heavy shoulder against the wood and violently forced the door open. He shoved his way directly into my personal living space, completely ignoring my boundaries. Jessica immediately followed right behind him, sobbing hysterically and frantically wiping her face with the back of her hand. I stepped back and crossed my arms over my chest, watching them invade my home. I did not yell or demand that they leave. I simply stood there and waited for the inevitable explosion. I knew exactly why they were here. The financial shockwaves I had meticulously orchestrated with my attorney Evelyn had clearly reached their absolute peak. Jessica was the first to completely break down. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and let out a loud, agonizing wail. She screamed that I had completely destroyed her entire life. She cried that she had driven to her exclusive country club to meet her wealthy friends for a post-holiday luncheon to show off her perfect marriage. But the moment she handed her keys to the valet, a massive commercial tow truck had suddenly pulled into the pristine circular driveway. She shrieked that her beautiful white leased Mercedes Sport utility vehicle had been hooked up and forcefully dragged away right in front of dozens of her elite socialite peers. She said her friends had stood on the clubhouse steps, openly pointing and whispering about her. She told me she was so profoundly humiliated that she could never show her face in her suburban neighborhood ever again. She demanded that I pick up my phone and call the auto insurance provider right that very second. She actually had the sheer audacity to order me to pay the massive cancellation penalties and have her luxury car delivered back to her driveway before the morning. She stood in my modest apartment, crying over a piece of German machinery that I had funded entirely out of my own pocket, and told me it was my fundamental duty as her sister to fix her public embarrassment. I looked at Jessica and felt absolutely nothing. The deep, lingering sadness I used to feel whenever my golden child's sister was upset had completely evaporated. I simply stared at her and waited for her husband to make his move. Brent violently stepped in front of Jessica, effectively shielding her from me. He closed the distance between us, using his tall, broad frame to aggressively invade my personal space. He loomed over me, his face just inches from mine. I could smell the sharp, bitter scent of stale alcohol on his breath. He had clearly been drinking to cope with the catastrophic collapse of his fraudulent business empire. He pointed a thick, rigid finger directly at my face, and his voice dropped into a low, dangerous growl. He completely ignored his wailing wife and focused entirely on the real reason for his panic. He demanded to know why his corporate bank accounts were completely frozen. He demanded to know why his primary silent investors had suddenly received a formal legal notice from me, invoking the call-in clause on his seed money. He said his investors were frantically calling him, threatening to involve the federal authorities because they could not access their capital. He told me that his entire venture capital fund was on the absolute brink of total collapse, and that I was personally responsible for ruining his brilliant career. I stood my ground. I did not step back. I looked up into his bloodshot eyes and kept my voice perfectly even. I calmly informed him that I was simply executing my legal rights as an independent financial creditor. I reminded him that the seed money I had provided him years ago came with a strict, legally binding promissory note. He had openly confessed on a hidden security camera to being severely over-leveraged and facing criminal charges for mismanaging investor funds. I told him that his own recorded words proved he was in a state of severe financial instability, which gave me the absolute legal right to demand the immediate return of my $150,000. Brent completely lost his mind. He aggressively backed me up against the edge of my kitchen island, slamming his heavy hand down on the granite countertop. He tried to physically intimidate me, hoping to break my spirit exactly the way he and my mother had planned to do on Christmas Eve. He leaned his entire body weight toward me and unleashed the most incredibly foolish threat I had ever heard in my entire professional life. He sneered at me and said that if I did not immediately restore his funding and call off my attorneys, he was going to personally report me to the Internal Revenue Service. He aggressively claimed that I was a corrupt accountant who was actively hiding millions of dollars in offshore accounts to avoid paying federal taxes. He threatened to trigger a massive governmental audit that would strip me of my certified public accountant license and throw me in federal prison for massive tax evasion. He demanded that I surrender to his authority immediately or face the absolute destruction of my entire professional career. I stared at him for a long, silent moment. He truly believed his fabricated threat was a brilliant, masterful move. He actually thought he could scare a highly trained senior financial auditor with the imaginary threat of an Internal Revenue Service investigation. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound echoed brightly in my small kitchen, bouncing off the walls and completely startling both of them. Jessica stopped sobbing and looked at me like I had suddenly lost my mind. Brent's face twisted into an expression of pure, confused rage. "You want to threaten a licensed corporate controller with a tax audit, Brent?" I asked smoothly. My voice was laced with pure professional amusement. My personal and corporate financial records are absolutely flawless. I file complex federal tax returns for a living. I literally welcome a government audit. But since we are so very interested in exposing financial truth today, I think it is time we discuss your actual business records. I smoothly sidestepped his large frame and walked over to my small wooden dining table. I completely ignored his aggressive physical posturing. I reached into my leather work bag and pulled out a massive, thick manila folder. I had spent the last 48 hours working directly with Evelyn's private investigative team to compile this exact document. I turned around, walked back to the kitchen island, and slammed the heavy folder down onto the granite countertop with a loud, resounding smack. I looked directly at Jessica, who was now staring nervously at the thick stack of papers. Then I looked at Brent. His arrogant sneer was slowly beginning to melt into a look of genuine, creeping terror. When you formally demand that a certified public accountant invest $150,000 of her own hard-earned money into your company, you should expect that she's going to monitor that investment, I stated coldly. You spent years parading around country clubs in custom suits telling my parents and your wife that you were a brilliant entrepreneur building a revolutionary digital marketing empire. You told them your company was just experiencing a minor temporary cash flow issue. You told my mother that you desperately needed a massive home equity loan to secure a brilliant new commercial contract. I placed my hand firmly on top of the manila folder. But you never built a company, Brent. I continued, my voice rising with absolute undeniable authority. You never signed a single commercial contract. Evelyn's forensic financial investigators completely dismantled your entire corporate structure in less than 2 days. We traced every single dollar of the seed money I gave you. We traced the mysterious trust fund money you claimed you inherited from your family. We followed every single digital transaction routing through your fake limited liability shell companies. Brent suddenly lunged forward, extending his hand to violently snatch the folder off the kitchen island. But I was much faster. I aggressively slammed my palm down on the cover, pinning it to the counter. I shot him a look of such pure, intense warning that he actually froze in his tracks. He slowly pulled his hand back, his entire body trembling with pure, unadulterated fear. You did not invest that money into any logistics network or marketing campaigns. I said, my words slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through an untraceable network of terrible cryptocurrency exchanges, hoping to hit a massive digital jackpot. When the crypto market collapsed and wiped out your primary capital, you completely panicked. You took whatever liquid funds you had left and you dumped them directly into illegal offshore sports betting platforms. Jessica let out a sharp, suffocating gasp. She stumbled forward, gripping the edge of the kitchen island to steady her shaking legs. She stared at the thick folder and then slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her eyes were completely wide with pure, absolute shock. "Brent, I do not understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What is she talking about? You told me the business was just expanding and we needed to wait for the fourth quarter returns. I flipped the heavy folder open and rapidly spread the official documented evidence across the granite countertop. I displayed the certified bank statements, the complex digital ledger traces, and the explicitly detailed wire transfer receipts from his offshore gambling accounts. The undeniable proof was laid out in stark black and white for everyone to see. "There are no fourth quarter returns, Jessica," I told my sister brutally. "There is no business. Your perfect, wealthy, highly successful husband is a complete and absolute fraud. He is secretly drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of catastrophic personal debt. The massive home equity loan that he and our mother tried to steal using my forged signature was not going to be used to save a company. It was going to be used to pay off his furious illegal bookies before they came knocking on the door of your beautiful suburban house." The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating. Jessica stared at the scattered bank statements, tracing the highlighted lines of text that showed massive outbound transfers to sketchy online casinos. She saw the dates. She saw the staggering amounts of money vanishing from their joint accounts. She saw the absolute, irrefutable truth of her entire marriage laid bare on my kitchen counter. The carefully constructed illusion of her perfect, wealthy country club life instantly shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was superior to me simply because she married a successful man finally realized that her entire existence was funded by a desperate scammer. Jessica slowly turned to face Brent. Her face was completely devoid of color. "You lied to me," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried a sharp, dangerous edge I had never heard from her before. "You told me we were rich. You told me I could lease that car. You told me I could quit my job and stay home with the kids because your investments were paying out massive dividends. You gambled away our entire future." Brent raised his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. He took a step toward her, his face twisted in desperate agony. "Jessica, baby, please listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking. It was just a temporary setback. The market shifted unexpectedly, and I just needed a little bit of leverage to win it all back. If Claire had just given me a little more time and restored my access to the accounts, I could have fixed everything. It is her fault for pulling the plug. She's trying to ruin us. He actually tried to blame me for his offshore gambling addiction. He actually tried to manipulate his wife into believing that my refusal to be a victim of severe identity theft was the root cause of his own criminal failure. But Jessica was not listening to his pathetic excuses anymore. The shock on her face rapidly hardened into a look of pure, absolute, venomous hatred. "You tried to steal from my sister to pay for your gambling debts," she screamed. The sheer volume of her voice was deafening. "You let my car get repossessed in front of the entire country club. You let my friends watch me get treated like a common criminal because you are a pathetic, broke liar. I am going to lose my house. I am going to lose everything because of you." The explosion was immediate and violently chaotic. Jessica threw herself at Brent, pounding her fists aggressively against his chest. She screamed every single insult she could muster, calling him a failure, a scammer, and a piece of garbage. Brent desperately tried to grab her wrists to stop her from hitting him frantically, begging her to calm down and keep her voice quiet. They stumbled backward into my small living room, knocking over a floor lamp and knocking a stack of magazines off the coffee table. Their perfect, prestigious marriage was completely disintegrating right before my eyes in the middle of my modest apartment. They screamed at each other with such intense, vicious hatred that the neighbors probably thought a physical war had broken out. They tore down every single lie they had built their relationship on, exposing the shallow transactional nature of their entire life together. I stood completely still behind the safety of my kitchen island, watching them destroy each other with absolute cold detachment. I did not intervene. I did not try to calm them down. I simply let the toxic poison of their own reality consume them. After 5 minutes of watching them violently tear their marriage apart, I had finally seen enough. I reached out and firmly slapped my hand flat against the granite countertop, creating a loud, sharp crack that instantly cut through their chaotic screaming. They both stopped and turned to look at me, panting heavily, their faces flushed and completely furious. I pointed my finger directly at my front door. My voice was absolute ice. "Get out of my house," I commanded softly. Brent opened his mouth to argue, but the look in my eyes completely silenced him. He knew he had absolutely no power left. He knew his entire life was completely over. He slowly turned around and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. Jessica grabbed her designer coat, wrapping it tightly around her wrinkled sweatpants. She looked at me for one brief, lingering second. There was no apology in her eyes. There was only the devastating realization that the sister she had mocked and belittled her entire life was the only reason she had ever lived in luxury. She turned and followed her ruined husband out into the cold hallway. I walked over and slammed the heavy door shut behind them. I quickly threw the deadbolt, locking them out of my life forever. The apartment fell back into a deep, profound, and absolutely beautiful silence. The first major battle of my ultimate retaliation was over, and I had won completely. The first week of January brought a bitter chill to Seattle, but inside the mahogany-paneled conference room of Hayes & Associates, the temperature felt completely perfectly controlled. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the polished grain of the massive table. My attorney, Evelyn Hayes, sat right beside me. She was reviewing her impeccable notes with the quiet, predatory focus of a seasoned hunter waiting for her prey to step into the clearing. Today was the day of the final family meeting. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, had aggressively demanded this formal sit-down. After receiving the 30-day eviction notice and realizing that my financial well was permanently closed, they had gone into an absolute panic. But true to their deeply arrogant nature, they did not come to apologize. They came to intimidate. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. My father walked in first. Thomas puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of a wealthy, powerful patriarch who was merely annoyed by a minor inconvenience. My mother, Barbara, followed closely behind him, clutching her expensive designer handbag like a protective shield. She wore a dark, elegant dress, attempting to look dignified and tragically wronged. But it was the man who walked in behind them that truly made me want to laugh out loud. My parents had brought their own legal representation. His name was Richard Vance, and he looked exactly like the kind of cheap strip mall lawyer you would hire from a late-night television commercial. He wore a poorly fitted suit that was a decade out of style, and he carried a battered plastic briefcase. My parents had clearly scoured the city for an attorney who would work for a fraction of the cost, or perhaps one who simply allowed them to yell their delusional demands without questioning the actual law. Vance aggressively slapped his briefcase onto the mahogany table and sat down heavily across from Evelyn. He did not bother with pleasantries. He immediately puffed up his chest and began to bluster loudly, trying to dominate the room through sheer volume. He pointed a thick finger at me and declared that we were gathered here to put an end to this ridiculous illegal charade. He stated that my eviction notice was entirely baseless and that he was fully prepared to sue me for severe emotional distress breach of implied verbal contract and elder abuse. He loudly proclaimed that my parents had lived in that estate for 8 years and had established undeniable squatter rights and equitable interest in the property. I did not flinch. I did not say a single word. I simply looked at Evelyn. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not even blink. She calmly picked up her silver pen and looked at Richard Vance with a mixture of profound pity and absolute professional disgust. She smoothly informed him that there was no such thing as an implied verbal contract when a certified legal deed clearly established sole ownership. She gently reminded him that equitable interest required actual financial contribution to the property taxes, the maintenance, or the mortgage, none of which his clients had ever paid. She then asked him a very simple question. She asked if he had actually reviewed the county property records before accepting my parents as clients. Vance visibly swallowed hard. His aggressive posture deflated just a fraction. He stammered slightly, claiming that the property records were a mere technicality and that family law dictated a duty of care. Evelyn shut him down instantly. She stated that we were not in a family court. We were in a real estate and corporate law setting. She told him that his clients were legally month-to-month tenants who had received a lawful standard 30-day notice to vacate the premises. When my father realized that their loud, cheap attorney was completely failing to scare us into submission, his face turned a deep shade of crimson. He slammed his fist on the table, demanding respect. He yelled that he was my father and that I owed him everything. He shouted that I was an ungrateful, spoiled child who was throwing away her own flesh and blood over a simple misunderstanding. That is when my mother, Barbara, decided to deploy her ultimate weapon. She realized the legal threats were completely useless, and my father's anger was achieving absolutely nothing. So she instantly switched tactics. She leaned forward in her chair, placed her hands over her face, and began to weep. It was a spectacular, theatrical performance. She forced loud, racking sobs from her chest. She looked at me with eyes full of manufactured tears and profound betrayal. "Claire, how can you do this to us?" she cried, her voice shaking with perfectly calculated dramatic agony. "I am your mother. I carried you in my body. I gave you life. I raised you and sacrificed everything for you. We gave you a beautiful childhood, and this is how you repay us. You are throwing us out into the cold streets like criminals. You are tearing this family apart over money. Please, sweetheart, look into your heart. You know you do not want to do this. We are your family." I sat there and watched her cry. I watched the woman who had openly plotted to ruin my financial future, sitting in her beautiful home, laughing about forging my signature. I watched her trying to use the very concept of motherhood to escape the consequences of her own malicious actions. Years ago, those tears would have completely destroyed me. I would have instantly caved, apologizing profusely and writing a massive check just to make her stop crying. But today, looking at her tear-streaked face, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard emptiness. I did not owe her my life simply because she gave birth to me. I did not owe them my financial security just because we shared the same genetic makeup. I looked at my mother and I did not see a loving parent. I saw a highly manipulative, emotional extortionist who was completely out of ammunition. I did not need to say a word to stop her crying. Evelyn did it for me. Evelyn reached into her pristine leather folder. She did not raise her voice. She did not show an ounce of emotion. She simply slid a thick stack of high-quality printed documents across the smooth mahogany table, stopping them right in front of Richard Vance and my parents. My father looked down at the papers, his face contorted in confusion. My mother's theatrical crying hitched and suddenly stopped. "Those are the bank records, the property deeds, and the complete financial ledger of the past 8 years. Evelyn stated, her voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. But more importantly, that stack contains the printed digital application for a massive home equity line of credit submitted just last week. An application that bears a highly convincing but entirely forged digital signature belonging to my client." Vance looked down at the papers. He reached out and picked up the top sheet. Evelyn continued relentlessly. "And beneath that application, you will find a certified, exact written transcript of the high-definition audio and video security footage taken directly from the living room of the estate. The footage clearly shows Barbara boasting to Thomas and Brent about forging that exact signature. The footage explicitly details a conspiracy to psychologically abuse my client into physically signing the final release documents to secure fraudulent funds. The silence that fell over the conference room was absolute and suffocating. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the terrifying, breathless quiet of a bomb detonating in an enclosed space. Vance rapidly flipped through the pages. His eyes widened as he read the transcribed dialogue. He read the exact words my mother had spoken. He read about their plan to break my spirit and lock me out in the snow. I watched the cheap lawyer's face turn entirely pale. He was a blustering, foolish man, but he was still a lawyer. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was holding irrefutable, documented evidence of a major federal crime. My father tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but a pathetic, strained squeak was the only sound that came out. He looked at my mother, who was now staring at the documents with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The color had completely vanished from her face. She looked at me, her mouth hanging open, completely unable to form a single excuse or lie. The reality of their situation had finally pierced through their thick armor of arrogance and delusion. I slowly leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the polished table. I looked directly at my father and then shifted my gaze to my mother. I locked eyes with her, ensuring she saw the absolute finality in my expression. "You sat in my house that I bought for you, and you tried to ruin my life," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You thought you could use my love for you as a weapon. You thought I was just a convenient bank account that you could abuse and manipulate whenever you wanted. You called me a spinster. You told Brent I was weak and desperate. I paused, letting the words hang heavily in the cold air of the room. You told me that family comes first, I continued. You sat there crying, asking how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. Well, let me make something absolutely crystal clear to both of you right now. People do not put their families in prison. I stared at them completely unblinking. But they do put fraudsters in prison. They do put identity thieves in prison. My father began to stammer. Claire, please, he choked out, his voice shaking violently. We were just desperate. Brent told us he was going to lose everything. We did not mean to hurt you. We just needed a little bit of help. You did not ask for help, Thomas. I snapped, instantly shutting down his pathetic attempt at an excuse. You plotted to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from me. You conspired to commit federal wire fraud. That is not asking for help. That is a massive felony. I leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute total control over the entire situation. Here are my terms, I stated firmly. You have exactly 30 days from the date of the original eviction notice to completely pack up your belongings and move out of my house. You will leave the property in pristine condition. You will not take a single fixture, a single appliance, or a single piece of hardware that belongs to that estate. If you are not completely gone by the end of those 30 days, or if you cause any damage to my property whatsoever, Evelyn will immediately hand this entire forensic file, including the unedited, high-definition video files, directly to the federal district attorney. I gestured toward the stack of papers resting in front of their attorney. You will be arrested, I said softly. You will be formally charged with federal wire fraud forgery and conspiracy to commit identity theft. You will stand trial, and you will absolutely go to federal prison. And you will spend the rest of your lives knowing that you destroyed your own future because you were too arrogant to realize who was actually paying for your perfect life. My parents sat completely paralyzed. They were physically breathing, but they looked entirely dead inside. The towering, arrogant patriarch facade my father had worn for 32 years was completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. He was just a terrified old man facing the very real prospect of a prison cell. My mother was completely silent. There were no more theatrical tears. There was no more manipulative weeping. She was staring down the barrel of total, absolute ruin. Richard Vance, the cheap, blustering lawyer, did not attempt to argue. He did not yell about implied verbal contracts or familial duty or emotional distress. He very quietly reached out and gathered the forged loan documents and the security camera transcripts. He neatly tapped the edges of the papers together on the table and slipped them into his battered plastic briefcase. He snapped the latches shut with a loud, sharp click that echoed in the silent room. He looked at my parents, his expression completely devoid of any professional courtesy. Take the deal, he advised them, his voice low and incredibly urgent. You need to take the deal, and you need to get out of that house immediately. I cannot defend you against this. Nobody can defend you against this. Vance stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and quickly walked out of the conference room without looking back. He abandoned his clients, entirely prioritizing his own legal license over their delusional demands. My parents were left sitting alone at the table, completely exposed and entirely defenseless. I looked at Evelyn, and she gave me a very small, satisfied nod. The meeting was officially over. There was absolutely nothing left to discuss. We had completely destroyed their illusion and backed them into a corner with no possible escape. I stood up from my leather chair and gathered my coat. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I did not feel any regret. I had given them everything I had for 8 long years, and they had thanked me by attempting to ruin my life. You have 28 days left, I said simply. I suggest you start packing. I turned and walked out of the mahogany conference room, leaving them completely alone with the terrifying reality of their own destruction. The heavy glass doors closed behind me, sealing them inside. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators, I felt a profound, immense sense of liberation. The toxic, heavy chains of my childhood were completely severed. The emotional extortion was permanently dead. I was finally completely and undeniably free. The final 28 days of my parents' residency in the massive colonial estate ticked by with the agonizingly slow rhythm of a dying clock. I did not visit the property. I did not call them, and I absolutely did not answer the dozens of desperate, frantic voicemails they left on my phone. Evelyn Hayes, my attorney, handled every single piece of communication. She informed me that my parents had tried desperately to find another lawyer to fight the eviction. They quickly discovered that no reputable attorney in the city would touch a case involving federal wire fraud and forged home equity applications. They were completely trapped by the undeniable evidence of their own malicious actions. On the final morning of the 30-day notice, I sat in my car parked across the street from the grand iron gates of the estate. The sky was a brilliant, crisp winter blue. I watched as a budget-moving truck idled in the driveway. There were no professional white glove movers, carefully packing fine china into custom crates. My parents could not afford that kind of luxury anymore. Instead, two tired-looking men were haphazardly loading cardboard boxes and a few pieces of heavy furniture into the back of the yellow truck. My father, Thomas, walked out the front door carrying a plastic bin. His shoulders were heavily slumped, and his expensive tailored suit had been replaced by a pair of faded jeans and an old sweater. He looked incredibly small. The towering, arrogant patriarch who had confidently thrown me out into a freezing blizzard just weeks ago was completely gone. My mother, Barbara, followed him down the front steps. She was not wearing her usual pristine designer dresses or her heavy gold jewelry. She looked thoroughly exhausted, her face pale and her posture rigid with a mixture of profound humiliation and absolute defeat. They did not look like the wealthy elite socialites who ran the local country club. They looked exactly like what they were, two people who had spent their entire lives living far beyond their means on someone else's dime. They climbed into their remaining car, an older sedan, that paled in comparison to the luxury vehicles they used to lease and drove slowly down the driveway. They handed the heavy brass house keys to Evelyn's associate, who was standing by the gate. They did not look back at the beautiful, sprawling house they had claimed as their own for 8 years. They simply drove away, disappearing down the winding suburban road. I knew exactly where they were going. Evelyn had run a routine background check to ensure they were actually vacating the premises. Thomas and Barbara had signed a 12-month lease on a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial edge of the city. It was a stark, brutal transition from their luxurious past. Their new building was situated next to a busy commercial highway, overlooking a massive concrete strip mall. There were no manicured lawns, no imported crystal chandeliers, and absolutely no velvet-roped galas. Their social exile was immediate and absolute. In the wealthy suburban circles, they had spent decades trying to impress gossip travels faster than light. When their country club memberships were aggressively terminated for non-payment, the whispers began. When my sister Jessica's pristine white Mercedes was publicly repossessed right in the country club driveway, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Their elite friends, the people they had prioritized over their own daughter, completely abandoned them. Phone calls went entirely unreturned. Holiday party invitations instantly dried up. The wealthy crowd is notoriously ruthless when someone falls from financial grace, and my parents were dropped from their social registry without a second thought. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of absolute perfection, was now forced to carry her laundry down to a communal basement machine. My father, who used to boast about his business acumen over expensive scotch, was now drinking cheap coffee on a tiny concrete balcony overlooking a highway overpass. But the collapse of my parents' false reality was only the first part of the fallout. The second part involved my sister Jessica and her arrogant husband Brent, and their destruction was far more severe because it involved federal authorities. When I invoked the aggressive calling clause on the $150,000 seed money I had loaned Brent, it triggered a massive chain reaction of financial panic. Brent's silent partners and corporate investors finally demanded to see the actual accounting books for his supposed digital marketing empire. What they found was a terrifying black hole of missing capital. Brent had never invested a single dollar into legitimate business operations. He had secretly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and illegal sports betting platforms. Less than a week after the new year, federal investigators formally arrived at Brent's leased corporate office. They immediately seized his hard drives, froze his remaining bank accounts, and launched a comprehensive inquiry into massive investor fraud. The confident, swaggering man who had cornered me in my apartment and threatened to report me to the Internal Revenue Service was now facing very real and very severe federal indictments. He was publicly exposed as a desperate scammer who had gambled away the life savings of his closest friends and partners. The devastating reality of Brent's criminal negligence completely shattered his perfect marriage. Jessica had spent her entire adult life believing she was the ultimate golden child simply because she had secured a wealthy, successful husband. She had constantly looked down on my modest accounting career and mocked my quiet single life. But when the federal agents froze all their joint accounts and the eviction notices began appearing on the door of their luxury rental home, Jessica finally understood the horrifying truth. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was the wife of a broke, desperate criminal. They'd say it. Jessica filed for divorce less than 2 weeks after Brent's assets were completely frozen. She packed whatever designer clothes she could salvage into cheap plastic trash bags and completely abandoned him. But Jessica had absolutely nowhere to go and zero independent income. She was forced to move directly into the cramped 2-bedroom highway apartment with Thomas and Barbara. I could only imagine the incredible toxic chaos of that tiny apartment. The three of them trapped in a cheap rental, bitterly blaming each other for their collective downfall. My mother crying about her lost country club status. My father furious at his loss of patriarchal power. Jessica sobbing over her ruined marriage and her repossessed luxury car. They were finally forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality they had built for themselves without my bank account there to constantly bail them out. They were completely cut off, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. While their world violently burned to the ground, my world was experiencing a profound and beautiful rebirth. The day after my parents surrendered the keys, I drove my reliable Honda Civic up the long paved driveway of the colonial estate. I parked near the grand entrance and turned off the engine. The air was silent. I walked up the wide stone steps and met the professional locksmith I had hired that morning. I stood there and watched as he systematically drilled out and replaced every single lock on the heavy oak doors. The sharp metallic click of the new deadbolts sliding into place was the most incredibly satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the absolute undeniable sound of securing my own boundaries. I stepped into the grand foyer and walked through the massive empty house. The space was enormous, echoing with my footsteps. Everywhere I looked, I saw the lingering ghosts of my mother's highly pretentious taste. The gaudy imported velvet drapes blocking out the natural light. The heavily patterned wallpaper that looked like it belonged in a Victorian museum. The dark, oppressive mahogany trim that made the sprawling rooms feel strangely suffocating. They had lived in this house for 8 years, filling it with their arrogance and their demands. I decided right then that I was not just going to live in this house. I was going to completely physically and emotionally cleanse it. I was going to erase every single trace of their toxic presence and rebuild it into a space that reflected genuine warmth and authentic peace. I spent the next several months hiring teams of professional contractors, painters, and interior designers. I used the money I was no longer draining into my parents' luxury lifestyle to fund a massive total renovation. We ripped down the heavy velvet drapes and let the bright, beautiful sunlight flood into the living room. We stripped the gaudy patterned wallpaper and painted the massive walls a clean, bright, crisp white. We tore up the dark, heavy carpets to reveal the stunning, natural hardwood floors underneath. We completely gutted the dark, oppressive kitchen where I had cooked so many thankless holiday meals and installed warm, open, natural wood cabinetry and bright stone countertops. The physical labor of managing the massive remodel was deeply therapeutic. With every swing of a hammer and every fresh coat of paint, I felt like I was systematically dismantling the heavy, towering monument of excuses I had built for my family over the past decade. I was no longer the quiet, unappreciated spare child. I was a highly successful, independent woman, creating a beautiful sanctuary entirely on my own terms. I furnished the newly brightened rooms with comfortable, meaningful pieces. There were no rigid, uncomfortable antique chairs meant only for display. There were deep plush sofas meant for actual resting. There were massive bookshelves filled with novels and biographies I loved. I filled the corners with tall green plants that brought life and oxygen into the space. I transformed the intimidating, formal dining room into a warm, welcoming gathering space built for genuine connection rather than pretentious social posturing. By the time the winter winds began to blow through Seattle again, wrapping the city in a familiar cold chill, the estate was completely transformed. It did not look like the Dixon family compound anymore. It looked exactly like my home. And for the very first time in my 32 years of life, I decided to host a major holiday gathering. I was not cooking a massive, stressful Thanksgiving turkey for 20 demanding, ungrateful relatives. I was hosting a spectacular New Year's Eve party to celebrate the absolute best year of my entire life. On the night of December 31st, the house was glowing with warm amber light. A bright, cheerful fire crackled perfectly in the massive stone fireplace of the main living room. Soft, upbeat music played through the newly installed sound system. The kitchen island was covered in beautiful platters of catered food and bottles of excellent vintage wine. But the most beautiful part of the entire evening was the people standing in my home. I had not invited a single person out of a sense of forced biological obligation. I had only invited the people who truly respected, valued, and supported me. My home was filled with my brilliant colleagues from the accounting firm, people who appreciated my sharp mind and my relentless work ethic. My true friends were laughing in the kitchen, sharing stories, and pouring drinks without ever expecting me to clean up after them. And standing right by the roaring fireplace, holding a crystal glass of champagne, was Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn looked completely out of her element in a casual setting, but she wore a warm, genuine smile that I had rarely seen during our intense legal battles. She had been the fierce, brilliant shark who helped me secure my legal fortress, but over the past year, she had become something much more important. She had become a trusted mentor and a deeply valued friend. I walked over to the fireplace and stood beside her, looking out at the living room filled with joyful, happy people. "You have done an incredible job with this place, Claire," Evelyn said softly, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "It feels completely different. It feels like it can actually breathe now." I smiled, looking around at the bright white walls and the comfortable furniture. "It feels like mine," I replied. "It finally feels completely mine." Evelyn turned and looked at me, her dark, piercing eyes softening with genuine pride. "You built this, Claire," she said firmly. "Not just the house. You built this life. You stopped letting them tell you what you were worth, and you forced them to pay the actual price of their arrogance. You survived the storm, and you came out holding the entire deed." I nodded, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute peace settle perfectly into my chest. For decades, I had believed that family was defined entirely by blood and biology. I had believed that I was obligated to sacrifice my own happiness, my own financial security, and my own basic dignity, simply because Thomas and Barbara had brought me into this world. I had let them convince me that my value was entirely dependent on how much money I could quietly funnel into their luxurious checking accounts. But standing in my beautiful, warm home, listening to the genuine laughter of people who actually cared about me, I finally understood the absolute truth. Family is not an obligation you are chained to at birth. Family is a choice. It is the people who show up for you when you are standing in a freezing blizzard. It is the people who respect your boundaries and celebrate your successes without demanding a piece of the credit. As the large grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, counting down the final seconds to midnight, the entire room gathered together. My friends raised their glasses, their voices filling the bright open space with joyful anticipation. I raised my own glass high into the air. I did not look back at the dark shadows of the past year. I did not think about my parents shivering in their cramped apartment, or Brent dealing with federal lawyers. I only looked forward at the brilliant, beautiful future I had successfully fought to secure. The heavy, toxic chains of my past were permanently broken. The grand illusion of my childhood was completely demolished, and the reality I had built in its place was absolutely spectacular. It is incredibly strange how quickly human beings can adapt to peace after spending an entire lifetime surviving in a constant state of war. When I wake up now in the bright, spacious master bedroom of the home I reclaimed from my parents, I do not feel that familiar tight knot of anxiety resting at the base of my throat. I do not immediately check my phone with a sense of dread, terrified of what new financial disaster my mother Barbara has manufactured overnight, or what new aggressive demand my father Thomas has decided to hurl my way. The morning air in my home is silent and calm and completely safe. It took me 32 years to understand what safety actually feels like, and it took me losing my entire biological family to finally find it. Looking back on the last decade of my life, I realized that the most profound damage my parents inflicted upon me was not the theft of my money. It was the deliberate, systematic theft of my self-worth. From the time I was a little girl growing up in the shadow of my sister Jessica, I was actively groomed to believe that love was a highly transactional commodity. I was taught through thousands of small, cruel interactions that I was not inherently valuable simply for existing. I was taught that my only actual value to the Dixon family was my utility. If I was quiet, if I was compliant, if I solved their problems, and if I paid their bills, then I was allowed to briefly stand in the outer orbit of their affection. But the moment I asked for basic respect, the moment I hesitated to write a massive check, or dared to establish a simple personal boundary, that affection was violently snatched away. Financial abuse within families is incredibly insidious because it perfectly hides behind deeply ingrained societal concepts like loyalty and duty and respect for your elders. When a stranger attempts to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from you, you call the police immediately. But when your own father sits in a leather chair, manufactures tears, and tells you that you are destroying the family name by refusing to pay his astronomical country club dues, the lines become completely blurred. Society conditions us to believe that family is everything. We are told to forgive and forget. We are told that we only get one mother and one father, and that we must honor them no matter how terribly they treat us. But I am here to tell you that this toxic narrative is an absolute lie. It is a lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers under the guise of familial obligation. Blood does not give anyone the right to destroy your mental health. Biology does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit your hard work and drain your resources. For 8 long years, I rationalized every single check I wrote. I told myself I was being a good daughter. I told myself that paying off their massive defaulted mortgage, covering their luxury car insurance, and funding Brent's fraudulent business ventures would eventually earn me a permanent seat at their table. I truly believed that if I just gave them enough money, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Jessica. I was so desperately hungry for a mother who would hold me and a father who would protect me that I willingly blinded myself to the glaring reality of their exploitation. But the truth is, you can never buy genuine love. Love is not a subscription service that you can maintain with monthly direct deposits. Real love does not demand your absolute submission, and real family does not lock you out in a freezing blizzard on Christmas Eve over a vintage necklace just to break your spirit. When I sat in my small apartment and watched that hidden security camera footage of my mother Barbara casually bragging about forging my signature on a massive home equity line of credit, something fundamental inside my soul permanently fractured. It was a deeply painful realization, but it was also the most incredibly liberating moment of my entire life. I watched the woman who gave birth to me plot to commit a major federal felony that would have completely ruined my professional accounting career and destroyed my financial future forever. And she did it with a cold, calculating smile on her face. She did it to save the fake entrepreneurial reputation of a son-in-law she valued more than her own flesh and blood. In that exact moment, the heavy, towering monument of excuses I had built for them completely crumbled into dust. I finally saw them exactly as they were. They were not struggling parents who just needed a little bit of help. They were completely ruthless predators who saw me as nothing more than an automated teller machine. Setting strong boundaries with toxic family members is incredibly difficult. It requires you to actively mourn the death of people who are still physically alive. You have to grieve the loss of the parents you always wanted but never actually had. When I instructed Evelyn Hayes to deliver that 30-day eviction notice to Thomas and Barbara, I felt a profound sense of grief, but I also knew with absolute unwavering certainty that setting that boundary was not an act of revenge. It was an act of pure survival. If I had allowed them to continue their behavior, if I had forgiven the forgery and swept their criminal conspiracy under the rug to keep the peace, they would have eventually drained me of every single thing I had worked so hard to build. They would have consumed my wealth, my career, and my sanity until there was absolutely nothing left of me. They would have destroyed my life, and they would have blamed me for the wreckage. Walking away from a deeply toxic family system requires a monumental amount of courage, especially when you are the designated scapegoat. The scapegoat is the person the family relies on to carry all the blame, all the heavy emotional burdens, and all the financial responsibilities so that the golden child can remain perfectly comfortable. Jessica was the golden child. She was allowed to be demanding, entitled, and financially reckless because my parents always ensured that I was there to silently clean up her messes. But when the scapegoat finally decides to walk away, the entire dysfunctional system collapses in on itself. That is exactly what happened to Thomas, Barbara, Jessica, and Brent. Without my bank account to sustain their grand illusion, they were forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own terrible choices. They lost the sprawling colonial estate. They lost their elite country club memberships and their luxury vehicles. They lost their wealthy social circle. Brent is currently navigating severe federal inquiries for his massive financial schemes and secret offshore gambling debts, and Jessica is navigating a bitter, humiliating divorce in a cramped highway apartment. They are living the exact life they built for themselves. I did not destroy them. I simply stopped preventing them from destroying themselves. I have spent the last year deeply reflecting on the true cost of my freedom. I used to think I had to buy my place in their lives for $950,000. Now I know that walking away from them was the only way to buy my freedom. That staggering amount of money was the absolute price of my complete liberation. I paid for my education in human nature, and I graduated with a masterclass in self-respect. The beautiful colonial estate that once served as a pristine prison of emotional extortion is now a genuine sanctuary. The dark, oppressive rooms have been filled with bright light and authentic joy. I no longer spend my holidays serving ungrateful people who view me with absolute contempt. I spend my time surrounded by my chosen family, my brilliant colleagues, my true supportive friends, and my incredible attorney, Evelyn, who showed me what it actually means to have someone fight fiercely in your corner. These are the people who value my mind, my heart, and my presence. They do not care about my bank account, and they do not demand my subservience. They simply love me for exactly who I am. It is a profound tragedy that we cannot choose the family we are born into, but it is a magnificent blessing that we hold the absolute power to choose the family we keep. You have the ultimate authority over your own life. You are the sole architect of your environment, and you hold the key to the front door of your existence. You do not have to allow toxic people to walk into your home and track their emotional mud across your floors simply because you share a last name. You do not have to endure disrespect, manipulation, or outright abuse in the name of preserving a family dynamic that is actively tearing you apart. If you are watching this and you have ever been the emotional or financial ATM for a toxic family, hear me now. You have the right to close the account. You have the right to walk away. You do not need to wait for a massive criminal betrayal like a forged loan document to justify your departure. You do not need a dramatic, explosive confrontation to validate your feelings. If a relationship consistently leaves you feeling drained, unappreciated, and fundamentally worthless, you have every single right to pack your bags and exit the situation. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to safeguard the resources you have worked so incredibly hard to acquire. You are allowed to say no without providing a lengthy, complicated explanation. No is a complete sentence, and it is often the most powerful word in the human language. When you finally stop pouring your vital energy into a bottomless pit of familial entitlement, you will be absolutely amazed by how much beautiful life you can build for yourself. Do not let society guilt you into maintaining connections with people who actively harm you. Do not let manipulative relatives convince you that your boundaries are an act of cruelty. Setting a boundary is an act of profound self-love. It is a declaration that your mental health, your financial security, and your future are worth protecting. It is a promise to yourself that you will no longer accept the role of the invisible, unappreciated savior. I survived the storm. I walked out of that freezing snow on Christmas Eve, and I built my own brilliant fire. I reclaimed my property, my identity, and my life. And I'm standing here today to tell you that you can do exactly the same thing. You hold so much more power than you realize. The moment you stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, you unlock a level of freedom that is absolutely breathtaking. Hit that like button if you think I did the right thing by protecting myself, and subscribe so you never miss another story about taking back your power. Tell me in the comments, what state or country are you watching from and what time is it there? I read every single one. Until next time, guard your boundaries and know your worth.